So, without further ado, in April 2016, as many of us in this room probably know, Beyoncé Knowles released her second visual album, Lemonade. While her previous eponymous visual album was released with music videos for each track, Lemonade was a cohesive hour-long film scored with the songs contained on the album. Within the explosion of articles, blog posts, think pieces, etc., that occurred after the album's release, many highlighted the ultimate space of forgiveness that the film and album seemed to reach by their close. Keon Fitzgerald for NPR argues that the album, quote, bends towards forgiveness and reconciliation. Sajay Elder writes for Noisy of the visual album's penultimate section, quote, this is the point where it's made clear what the album is really about, resilience through love and healing. Bell Hooks, in her rather strident criticism of the piece, writes, quote, in this fictive world, Black female emotional pain can be exposed and revealed. It can be given voice. This is a vital and essential stage of the freedom struggle, but it does not bring exploitation and domination to an end. While all of these pieces are arguing slightly different things, aimed at slightly different audiences, and are presented in various formats, they are brought together by the structure of linear progression that shapes their readings of Lemonade. While I do not mean to discount this viewing or listening experience that ascribes to such readings, is this linear trajectory from anger to healing the only mode of engagement that Lemonade allows for? I argue instead that Lemonade's structure, along with the Southern Gothic tradition that it visually cites, creates a space in which time is not linear, progression is not always positive, and anger is useful. Lemonade is not a clean production. It is deliberately messy, invoking discourses of Beyoncé and Jay-Z's supposedly fraught marriage, police brutality and the murders of Black men throughout the United States, and Beyoncé's own relationship to her Black Southern heritage in ways that are difficult to put into neat hermeneutic boxes. Linear narrative analyses overlook the complicated histories of misogynoir, violence, and alienation from and in the South. They're also a crucial part of Lemonade's trajectory. However, this messiness, a term I will later engage with through the works of Japanese feminist Nakamitsu, is precisely what allows Lemonade to stand as a piece that does not negate the rage and betrayal we see throughout the first half of the narrative, with a sequence that proposes these states to be transient emotions in the journey towards an ultimate goal of forgiveness and reconciliation. Instead, the anger that simmers throughout Lemonade refuses to be simply a transitory affect and states its place throughout the film. Just as the frame "and sorry" oscillates between sorry and I ain't sorry, of course we know the song concludes on a particularly unapologetic note, Lemonade itself is a visually and narratively complicated text that questions a goal-oriented mode of narrative analysis and recognizes the liberatory power of remaining in one's anger as a Black woman. To be more specific about the nature of this power, I turn here to Audre Lorde's classic, The Uses of Anger. While this work is, of course, speaking to the context of white feminism's dismissal of Black women's rage, her works reimagine what anger can do or generate when one engages rather than sweeping it away as an obstacle to liberation. Lorde proposes that we begin to stand still, to listen to its anger's rhythms, to learn with it, to move beyond the manner of presentation to the substance, to tap that anger as an important source of empowerment. If we do so, anger can become used for illumination, laughter, protection, fire in places where there was no light, no food, no sisters, no quarter. In my following analysis, I argue that 3 specific passages in Lemonade invoke these uses of anger and ensure that it remains within the emotional background of the film. Hold Up reveals anger's ability to become illumination and laughter. Daddy Lessons highlights the protection that can come with holding on to one's wariness and rage. Forward, and the sequences that surround it, shows that refusing to move on from anger can be the basis of a community that provides sustenance: food, fire, sisters, and quarters. While picking these 3 moments may seem to be a somewhat arbitrary choice, the recurrence of anger I see in each of these moments bars interpretations of the second half of the visual album that close the door on thinking about the persistence of rage at mistreatment by both domestic partners and the oppression of patriarchal and racist structures. However, this repetitive generation of anger does not only occur at the level of narrative in Lemonade. I argue that the imagery evoked by Beyoncé and Khalil Joseph, her co-director, calls forth an alternative temporality, that of the Southern Gothic, which can allow for us to stand still and listen to anger's rhythms, the sight lord again, without necessarily having the impetus to move forward. So I've got the video for Sorry playing in the background here on silent as kind of an illustration of the imagery I'm talking about. As many others have observed, Lemonade explicitly references spaces and modes of rural life in the South that are fraught with traumatic memories for Black Americans or have become wrapped up in the mythos of Southern whiteness. Imagery such as plantation big houses, live oak trees covered with Spanish moss, and weathered old sheds have marked the South as a place bound by, quote, the haunting of slavery, which, quote, which characterized, quote, by its objection, becomes an uncanny place, a location of Gothic affects, to quote Meredith Miller here. However, as Collier Meyerson has written of Lemonade, these visuals also serve as, quote, a reminder to Black women that we are of this place, the sticky, sordid South that has left an indelible mark on us and we on it. Our collective body and memory stands in its tall grass, on its creaky stairs, outside of its slave sheds, end quote. The labor, pain, and exploitation of Black bodies, and specifically Black women's bodies, is crucial to the project of imagining the Southern Gothic as a space othered from the imagined temporality of the mainstream United States. The dual-layer objection of the South, in which the nation marginalized the South for its supposedly regionally and temporally bounded histories of slavery, and for the objection of its Black population, discursively creates the Southern Gothic, a textual and visual space in which time cannot progress, that simply repeats itself in service to the national progressive imagination. However, what Lemonade does is mobilize that stillness, that lack of progression, and turns it into a time in which we can remain in anger and unearth its multiple uses. The Southern Gothic Temporality I Imagine, informed by Bliss Qua Lin's 2009 Translating Time, Cinema, the Fantastic and Temporal Critique, mobilizes this discursively congealed time to resist frameworks of progress and open up space for stories that do not depend on linear interpretation or rational subject positions. While Lim is writing in the context of post-colonial Philippine cinema, Lemonade also operates in a mode of fantastic filmic expression, which Lim claims shows a propensity towards temporal critique, discrete temporalities incapable of attaining homogeny with or full incorporation into a uniform chronological present, end quote. The visual album citation of the American Southern mythos, West African religious tradition, and, as we just saw, representations of Nefertiti, just to name a few, creates a fantastic space where imagery and traditions mix in a formation that comprises part of the often contradictory and complicated imaginary of the Black Southern experience. This mode of time, to quote them again, strains against the logic of clock and calendar, unhinging unicity of the present by insisting on the survival of the past or the jarring coexistence of other times, end quote. Past, present, and future commingle with one another. Generational trauma and rage converse across time, and Beyoncé reclaims a space for Black female anger that refuses to give ground within the South. To transition now into the section of the film explicitly entitled Anger, we pass through perhaps the most notorious section of Lemonade, Hold Up. Beyoncé, clad in yellow, walks through a 1970s inflected Main Street, mirthfully smashing in windows with a baseball bat. While it has been remarked that this segment of the visual album seems to directly reference Swiss visual artist Bloody Grease, 1997, Ever Is Overall, there are no police to be seen in this urban space to discipline or approve in wrist piece of Beyoncé's actions. The nostalgic Main Street becomes joyously enlivened by destruction. In Hold Up, Beyoncé practices a broken windows anti-policing, in which anger becomes brightness and laughter, quote Lord again, and generates a communal space of celebration within the imagined urban past for Black and brown bodies who play joyfully in the streets. It is here that I turn to the work of 1970s Japanese feminist Tanaka Mitsu and her argument for the use of one's messy and disorganized emotions rather than pushing towards ideals of progression and productivity that she argues are indicative of rational masculinism that plagued the leftist student movement at the end of the 1960s in Japan. The subtitle of Tanaka's 1972 book, Inochi no Onakatie, Kurimidashi Uma Ryuron, Towards a Living Womanhood, a Disorderly Theory of Women's Liberation, formed the essence of what it means to live as a human and as a woman. Setsu Shigematsu argues in her 2012 book on the Japanese women's liberation movement that Tanaka's woman on the never-ending journey to liberation, quote, did not and could not know herself because she had never been free to be herself, but that a conscious turning towards the painful and contradictory condition of one's existence produced Tanaka's conception of liberation as a chaotic and disorderly process. A subject who, having been denied access to rational masculine subjectivity, uses this messiness and confusion of the subjectless position to affirm herself not as a perfect revolutionary subject, but rather, in her totality, as an imperfect contradictory subject. The lyrical content of Hold Up, the celebratory violence of the video, and the nonlinear temporality that governs the visual album proposes this disorderly subject. At this point, it is obvious that Beyoncé is aware of her partner's infidelity, but rather than moving into a space of undiluted anger, Hold Up presents a woman who has not completely decided whether she would rather look jealous or crazy. It is unclear whether she would like to acknowledge the love that they shared, or perhaps shared, as a mark of her superiority as a partner, whether she would like to accuse her partner of wrongdoing in order to witness his repentance, or she would rather end the relationship altogether, as is perhaps indicated by the following song on the album, Don't Hurt Yourself. The refrain of the song concludes that she would rather be crazy, laughing brightly and embracing the deranged and messy state that Tanaka argues for as a liberatory mode of subjectivity. Here, I turn to the midpoint of Lemonade, Beyoncé's reclamation of country western aesthetics, Daddy Lessons. Some have interpreted this as the moment within the album in which the process of reconciliation between Beyoncé and her previously estranged father, Matthew Knowles, and between Beyoncé and Jay-Z finally begins. However, if you look at this sequence through the lens of Southern Gothic Temporality and Tanaka Nietsu's messy, violent subject position, one can see the supposed turning point as a moment that moves us deeper into an ambiguous but productive whirlpool of anger that circulates throughout Lemonade. An extended spoken word section that invokes uncanny doubling and ambiguous subject positions precedes Daddy Lessons, and I'll play the words of Warsaw Shire as recited by Beyoncé here.
We inherit the earth. Teach me how to make him beg. Let me make up for the years he made you wait. Did he bend your reflection? Did he make you forget your own name? Did he convince you he was a god? Did you get on your knees daily? Do his eyes close like doors? Are you a slave to the back of his head? Am I talking about your husband or your father?
And then we move into the song, of course. This invocation, which has been preceded as well by a piece from Warsaw Shire that talks about a daughter wanting to resemble her mother by wearing makeup and dressing up, generates an extremely intense network of generational connections in which husbands and fathers, quote, magicians able to exist two places at once, to cite an earlier mention of Warsaw Shire's poetry, become indistinguishable as sources of recurring domestic trauma. The pain of mothers blends into the pain of daughters as structures of patriarchal abuse become repeated in both marital and parental relationships. Daddy Lessons is a piece that can not only be read through the lens of Beyoncé's personal backstory, but must be viewed as speaking to the communal trauma of Black mothers and daughters at the hands of fathers and intimate partners, but perhaps more importantly, structural patriarchy and its intersection with structural racism. As the sequence progresses, time, space, and degrees of filmic verisimilitude become mixed together in a way that denies a neat hermeneutic analysis. Documentary footage is mixed with Beyoncé's performance of the song with a shadowy guitar man. When we see a father and daughter on horseback on a paved road, it is immediately rhymed with a shot of Beyoncé riding alongside a country road, and yet another moment of doubling throughout this segment. However, when we hit the midpoint of the song, the music pauses as home videos of Matthew Knowles with the young Beyoncé and with her own daughter, Blue Ivy, become added into the mix. As Matthew and Beyoncé discuss having fun with grandparents, the scene jumps approximately 30 years into the future as Blue Ivy and her grandfather Matthew play in a hotel room. This collapse of space and time grants the potential for the song's lyrics to indicate all or none of the situations referenced by the visual material presented. Southern Gothic Temporality, as evoked by scenes of the world, horses and cowboys, suburban decay depicted in the documentary shot, and this uncanny doubling of mothers, daughters, husbands, and fathers resists an interpretation that sees this moment in the film as a pathway to reconciliation and redemption. At the conclusion of the chorus, when trouble comes to town and men like me come around, becomes a bit ambiguous or perhaps ironic, as the song has just been preceded by a poem that links untrustworthy fathers to untrustworthy partners. Here is the father a protective figure or the trouble itself that has arrived? These conflated identities reach new heights of irony at the bridge of the song as Beyoncé sings, quote, "My daddy warned me about men like you. He said, baby girl, he's playing you." One cannot help but wonder if this warning is based on the father's own self-knowledge, as fathers, daughters, and partners become connected in a seemingly endless cycle of betrayal, anger, and reconciliation, which repeats generation after generation. The only recourse offered in the song is vigilance, and perhaps violence, to shoot. To return to Nakamitsu, contradictory feelings of anger, betrayal, and reconciliation are not relegated to being dealt with through rational consideration, but potential acts of violence against an uncertain enemy. Daddy Lessons never says who to shoot, but does make clear that the ultimate goal is protection. Take care of your mother. Watch out for your sister. Here, I reach my final reading of Lemonade, in which the anger that is not dissipated as simply a stage on the progressive journey towards forgiveness becomes sustenance. Fire in places where there was no light, no food, no sisters, no border. Following perhaps the most explicit sequence of reconciliation in the film, Sandcastles, we move into the resurrection section and return to the space of the rural Southern Gothic. Visually citing Julie Nash's Daughters of the Dust, the space of the plantation, filled with old oaks, with Spanish moss, and weathered old cabins, becomes a space for Black female sociality. However, we are soon transported to yet another spatial and temporal location, as the interlude forward begins. Beyoncé herself tosses away photographs and James Blake intones forward. As Beyoncé herself tosses away photographs and James Blake intones forward, the film moves through shots of Black women holding photographs of men they have lost, including, though I do not show them here, the mothers of Trayvon Martin, Eric Garner, and Mike Brown. In this moment, it becomes impossible to read Lemonade as simply a text of a scorned woman coming to terms with her partner. The anger, pain, and grief that brings these women together is directed at systematic racism and the criminalization of Black bodies that has made it impossible or even undesirable to move forward if it means leaving behind those we have lost. Anger, or negative affect more generally, is not an isolating influence here. It becomes the root for solidarity and for imagining alternative liberation while recognizing the productivity of remaining with one another in anger and not moving towards a goal of reconciliation or forgiveness that requires forgetfulness. Following forward, the film returns to the reclaimed plantation space in which Black women are brought together by the shared trauma, anger, and hope, the title of this segment. Lemonade here rewrites the deeply fraught space of the plantation kitchen as women communally cook for one another. I say rewrite here, but I should be clear that this is a palimpsest. Those fraught histories of objection and subjugation of Black women's labor under slavery have not been forgotten or forgiven. Instead, this reoccupation of space, vacant of white people, as some have observed, knowingly cites the objection of Black female bodies, so crucial to the formation of the Southern Gothic, and uses it to productively reimagine communities that unapologetically reclaim and remain in the space of the plantation. Here, the shared anger and trauma that we have witnessed throughout Lemonade creates a community that gives light, food, sisters, and quarters to its members. The persistence of anger, as it cycles through messy and conflicting emotional states and refuses to be passed through on a linear journey to forgiveness or relegated to a corner of irrational affect, becomes the strength of Lemonade. Anger, I argue, becomes a seed for joyful, protective, and unifying power for Black women across temporal and spatial modes. As the beginning of freedom begins to play, we find a promised liberation through standing still and listening to the angry, messy, and conflicted subject, rather than insisting on pushing through to rational and forgetful reconciliation. Thank you. So if anyone has any questions, I think we'll go with the same format as the last group. Over the corner.
Hi. You kind of talk about 3 different songs and 3 different stages of anger, and I was wondering, for me, what was kind of amazing about this album is the different, so many different genres that she touches. So I was wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about how you think the different genres in each of the songs and the segments that you talk, if you think that they kind of connect with the type of anger that she's talking about.
Great, thank you so much for that question. I know it's a paper at a music conference that doesn't actually really talk about the music, right? Sorry. I mean, I think actually probably the point in Lemonade that made me come to this paper the most and that was really provocative for me, and that also relates to musical genre, is Daddy Lessons, of course, because she's going back to this country western tradition that has been, I would say, appropriated by whiteness in the United States, a particular type of whiteness in the United States, that ignores the Black cultural roots that this genre has, of course. So I think in that moment in particular where it's being visually incorporated into these things that have been associated with the white southern world, people on horseback, cowboys, being in rural spaces, mixing that musical genre with that imagery is something that really powerfully says that reclaiming this space, taking back what has been appropriated by other people and using it for a certain kind of protection in addition to the narrative protection I'm arguing for, is a really powerful act that we can make in this moment. I don't think that fully answers your question, but keep it short for now. But that's really thought-provocative. Thank you.
I was wondering in relation to your analysis that you've done, have you thought about this relation to the Daughters of the Dust in terms of what you're presenting here and the relationship there? Just curious about that.
Yeah, so this is something that comes in the longer version of the paper that I had to violently slash last night. But I wanted to... Daughters of the Dust, I actually only saw it very recently at the suggestion of one of my colleagues who's here right now. But the weird temporality, of course, that's invoked in Daughters of the Dust, in which the ancestors are always with us, that moving towards modernity and the north of the Great Migration is something that will disconnect us from that moving temporality, is something that I think is also really being cited here beyond the kind of Southern Gothic stuck temporality that's connected to objection. I think that's one way that you can read the way that that time that is not allowed or refuses to move forward happens, but there's also that flip side in which there's a tradition that's revealed at least, or perhaps constructed in Daughters of the Dust, says that the Black community can have a way of thinking about time that resists homogenous, empty, progressive time and says that we're not moving away from our roots. I wish I could have time to explore that more, but thank you so much for that question.
I was just going to ask you, it seems like Black women aren't allowed to express their emotions without disapproval, and we seem to be treated like we're not humans. And anytime we do express emotions, there's always some sort of criticism, and I don't understand why. You know, other women are allowed to express their emotions, we should be able to do them as well.
Yeah, I completely agree with that, and that feeling is part of what led me to this paper and what led me to deliberately use frameworks of women of color that are saying, no, there is space for emotions and bodies that cannot conform to normative white femininity in a way. And I think that's really the power of Nakamitsu's work, in which she's not saying that emotions, be they messy, problematic, or otherwise, have to in some way be boxed back in to a rational subjectivity or a rational mode of expressing them. You know, you don't have to, you know, put academic words or nice, you know, polite lady tones on your words to have your emotions be recognized and expressed. That messiness in and of itself is a liberation. Allowing for that space of expression is a mode of liberation that I think is really powerful to think about in this moment right now as we try to make space for ourselves to feel. So thank you for that.
Thank you. I'll be very quick. Mine is really just a question for the sake of follow-up. There's a lot in here that was just very dense and very provocative for me, and really reimagining how we attribute anger to, you know, and how we consider that when it is being expressed by Black people. Like how do you explore revisiting that sort of narrative. And I just wanted to know if and how there would be a way to follow up with this paper, if there's a way that we could read it in the future, because I mean, I would just want to delve back into this and like keep this going and spread that information to other people. So you know how to, where to do that.
Thank you so much for that. I mean, it's a work in progress. It's a project that is starting, and hopefully it will be published somewhere. But I should have put my email address on this PowerPoint or something like that. But if you go to the Harvard East Asian Languages and Civilizations website, you can find my email address. If you'd like to get in contact, I'm happy to share paper or exchange thoughts with anyone about where this project could go. So thank you for that.
Awesome. Thank you.